hear them, so we'll just have to kind of take our word for it that they've joined. We'll be monitoring their chat box during it, so they'll be able to ask questions, which Jennifer will monitor and ask us as time passes. But now it's my great honour to introduce our main act of the evening. So JD and I have just had dinner round the corner, and he's an interesting man. He's the Chief Medical Officer of NASA. That you would take the call if that happened, wouldn't you? You would take the call. If the Chief Medical Officer of NASA calls you, you probably answer. So I asked him about his family. He's been married for 31 years. He's got 2 boys, both gainfully employed, he said, and not on his dollar anymore. And he's been married for 31 years. He has been an emergency physician. He's been a doctor inside NASA for a number of years. He's done a number of other things in the forces around the US, as you can imagine. We had a long chat about what he actually did. The best summary he gave me, and he said, this sounds a bit twee, but it's unusual to have a job where you can work on stuff that helps the whole world. That's quite a good sentence, don't you think? Working on stuff that helps the whole world. And he'll introduce what he does, how he does it, and how he links to NASA. We were very, very fortunate to have him on a QI Connect call where we had an hour on the Chilean mining disaster and how NASA helps with the Chilean miners. If you want that story, you can find it on our podcast where you heard JD give us that story. But JD, you're very, very welcome to Scotland, even with no sleep. We're really grateful that you've made the journey again. And please welcome the Chief Medical Officer of NASA, Dr. JD Polk.
Thanks, Jason. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm not used to looking up this high at my screen. This is pretty cool. Nina, I couldn't ask for a better introduction on this. I mean, I want to take you wherever I go. You're kind of like that pre-rock concert music thing that goes on. Let's get past the really big picture of me here. There we go. So we're going to talk about a few things. Nina was actually, despite the fact that Nina and I didn't plan this, she was a great opener. You'll see why. There's a lot of things that we are doing in spaceflight. When I say we, I mean the international community that's working on the International Space Station and Moon and Mars. Many of it that impacts your lives and you have absolutely no idea. And so, you know, all those folks that say, well, why are we, spending money on space? It'll become very clear where some of these things come down, especially into healthcare and into medicine. And so, usually when I tell folks I'm the Chief Medical Officer at NASA, they look at me a little funny when I'm introduced to other medical groups, et cetera. Like, so what do you do? I mean, are you like operating on aliens? Are you astronauts? What does the Chief Medical Officer of NASA do? Well, we are part mad scientists because we do a lot of research, and the research that we do is very innovative. It has to be very forward-leaning. The difficulty is the research that we do at NASA is not like the research I did at the Trauma Center and medicine in general, because our N is so small, the number that we have. You got to remember how many people have only flown in space and how many are flying right now in the International Space Station. So we have a saying that 1 is a case study, 2 is a series, 3 is a prospective randomized trial at NASA. So we have to be part research. You have to be part Dr. McCoy because you're taking care of the astronauts and you're working on technologies that folks are going to work on later. And you have to be 2 parts operational. And to give you an idea of some of the operations that we do, on the left, we're flying in what's called the KC aircraft, which has a colloquial term of the vomit comet. That's an aircraft that goes up in a very steep climb and then drops down and gives you 30 seconds of weightlessness and then comes back up again. And that's how we test some of the procedures that we're going to make. Even little things, eye drops, for example. How would you treat an astronaut with eye drops? Because eye drops don't drop in space. So actually the way you have to write the procedure is the astronauts create a small ball of the medication and then they stick their eye in it and the surface tension allows it to adhere. So even little things like that have to be worked out for the astronauts in the procedures and programs. And then we monitor them on spacewalks and of course monitor their health throughout the mission. This is where we're going. Again, this is 50 years ago. Hard to believe that was 50 years ago. But I want you to think about humanity for a moment. I mean, only about 110 years ago, we actually learned to fly. And so if you think about that, less than 58 years later, we landed on the moon, and now we're looking at going to do missions beyond the moon and Mars. That's a pretty interesting thing. And so part of why go back to the moon? We've already been there, but this time is different. We're not going for the primary purpose that we did back then. We're going for the primary purpose to use the moon as a test bed for Mars, because it's, for lack of a better term, in our neighborhood. If something goes wrong, something goes south, if you will, with the mission, it's 3.5 days back, like Nina mentioned. When you go to Mars, not so much. And so it flips what we call the life-limb mission paradigm. We were talking about that at dinner. What does that mean? If you scratched your eye on the International Space Station right now, and you got a corneal abrasion and it didn't heal, and we used Tobrex on it, and you're starting to get scarring, I would not make an astronaut sacrifice their eyeball right now, going around the Levin Eye Institute every 90 minutes with their eyes pressed against or their nose pressed against the glass looking at it. We would bring them home and we would treat them, and we would not allow them to lose their eye. But if you go to Mars, it's 6 months to Mars. Mars doesn't line up with the Earth again for another 18 months. It's 6 months back. You scratch your cornea on Mars, you're not coming back. So it's a flip of the life-limb mission paradigm. And that's why we're going to use that for a test bed there. But this is called our journey to Mars, and what we're trying to do over the next several decades to get us there, both this decade and the next, we are actually going to fly in what's called solar max, when the sun is at its maximum. Now, why would you want to do that? You would think the radiation would be too high. Why do you want to go when the solar is at its max? Because when the radiation from the sun is high, the cosmic galactic radiation is low. The solar radiation interferes with cosmic galactic radiation. And I want you to think of them as two things. Think of solar radiation like a shotgun, little pellets, which you can block. You can put lead or hydrogen or other things to block that kind of radiation. Cosmic galactic radiation is like a very high-powered sniper rifle. That radiation is a high-energized particle that's coming from outside our solar system, zipping through our solar system, and it goes through anything. There's nothing that blocks it. It goes through the spacecraft, goes through the astronaut. One of those we worry about for acute radiation sickness, one we worry about for long-term radiation exposure and cancer, which is the cosmic galactic radiation. So we would actually travel or try to plan our mission during solar max. Now, right now is an exciting time. We are actually at the tipping point in human spaceflight. Apollo was great. We had 3 vehicles we worked on. We worked on the lander, the capsule, and of course the Saturn V. We have 8 vehicles that I'm working on right now that take up an enormous amount of my time. We help and design the standards and requirements for vehicles like SpaceX and Boeing. They're building those to our specifications and requirements. Virgin right now just launched in December again, returned and actually got to the 50-mile mark, which is our determinator for space where someone gets their space wings. So the 2 pilots from Virgin in December, just this last week, got their commercial spaceflight wings from the Federal Aviation Administration. C.J. Sturkow was one of the pilots. He's actually a former NASA Space Shuttle pilot. But Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, is also about to launch people into space in the next year. And this one, again, suborbital, going into suborbital and then coming back down. Everyone knows Elon. Elon's building this vehicle for us, which we will launch actually in March, this March. And that vehicle will first launch uncrewed as a test flight, and then we will have it as a crewed flight later in the year or the beginning of next year, most likely at the end of this year, if all goes well in the engineering. And then there's Boeing. Boeing's capsule is also being built at our behest. Both SpaceX and Boeing going to the International Space Station. Sierra Nevada building a miniature space plane already built that will fly cargo back and forth to the International Space Station. Bigelow Aerospace building inflatable modules, one of them that we have on the International Space Station right now. And then our new SLS and Orion spacecraft. Now, why would you need 3 capsules? I mean, that sounds like a bit of overkill, right? except they all have different jobs. So SpaceX and Boeing are going up into the International Space Station and back. The one for Orion will be going out to the moon and Mars and back. The speed that that capsule will take coming back into the atmosphere and the heat from its heat shield is about 10 times what the other capsules will take. So there are vastly different design requirements for those capsules based on their missions. This gives you an idea of the rocket. We've already done these test missions. As you can tell, EM1 is our next one, where we will test, again, uncrewed, the capsule and the whole stack, and then EM2 is where we will send the entire stack up with the astronauts up. And that's hopefully at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, most likely. I think the shutdown may have put us down a little bit to the right. The gateway, this is what we're using to go to the moon, is the gateway and the deep space transport. Why take a miniature space station around the moon? The problem with landing on the moon is then you're kind of stuck looking at things just in that area that you landed in. Versus if you are taking a little miniature space station around the moon and you're going back and forth using it as your base, not as the lunar base, you can go and explore multiple different places on the moon, the poles, other different places in the equator, etc. So think of it as the orbiting base station, if you will, for the lander that's going to go back and forth. Of course, the International Space Station, which Nina mentioned, 250 nautical miles above the Earth, 17,500 miles an hour, 26 countries in 16 years and counting. I get electronic medical records and views of someone's retina from a clinic that's traveling at 17,500 miles an hour at 240 nautical miles above the Earth. So when a clinic can't get its electronic medical records from the hospital across the street, I have absolutely no empathy. Okay, so why explore? Nina hit on this a little bit. Does anybody know what this is? Any guess? I'll give you a hint. It is one of the best inventions that to help end-stage heart failure. Wait, what? That is a space shuttle main engine. Now, wait, how does that help heart failure? Dr. DeBakey was the cardiothoracic surgeon working on the left ventricular assist device, which is a device that helps pump blood in a failed heart back up into the aorta to supply the body and the brain blood. And somebody in end-stage heart failure is a bridge to transplant. He was having a problem. The impeller, there's a different type of impeller versus propeller. Impeller pushes the column of fluid up into the center, and you try to get it into a spin to do what's called a rouleau formation or a stack, so it kind of spirals up. If you don't, then it has this thing where it'll have eddy currents coming off of it, which can create clots, and you don't get enough flow going up. And he was having a horrible time with the impeller. He couldn't get it to work right, and he thought, who else pushes fluid up against a lot of resistance? Well, the space shuttle does. The space shuttle's impeller pressed fuel up in a column, and remember all that gravity going the other direction, and it has to push that column of fuel up so that the engine doesn't stop. And so he went to NASA in Houston and said, hey, I got a problem with this thing. I've got these patients that are supposed to have this pump in, and my impeller it's just not working right. And of course the engineers, they love that, right? I mean, they're going to start working on it. So a miniaturized, smaller version, obviously much, much, much smaller, of the Space Shuttle main engine impeller is in that left ventricular assist device. So a patient in end-stage heart failure bridging to transplant owes part of their history for a left ventricular assist device to the Space Shuttle main engine. Now, if you're from Canada, you know what that is. That's the Canada arm on the International Space Station. It has a very sophisticated algorithm. You remember, this vehicle is flying at 17,500 miles an hour, and you got somebody stuck on the end of an end effector, and you're trying to translate them to different parts during a spacewalk. You don't want to smash them against the space station. Very bad to whip an astronaut against the space station. It's frowned upon by flight surgeons. And so it has to have a very intricate computer software to know exactly where it is in space and to move that arm very intricately. And that same software is used in NeuroArm to allow neurosurgery to move those probes, exact same algorithms developed for the International Space Station arm. Most of you have been to your doctor's office and did not know you had thermal imaging used on you at some point in your doctor's office. The thermal imaging is what allowed us to do this, where someone sticks a probe in your ear and gets the temperature. They're looking at a thermogram, essentially, of your tympanic membrane. I think most of you know this. This is Tim Peake. What is he working on? He's working on an experiment on the International Space Station that measures nitric oxide and nitric acid. Nitric oxide, interesting thing about your cells, especially your airway cells, when they get inflamed, they start to secrete the nitric oxide and acid slightly before all the edema and the wheezing occurs. So imagine if you had your child and you were able to identify when they are secreting that before they have their asthma attack, so you can preemptively give them the medication before they start wheezing and before they get into trouble. One of our researchers working on ultrasound, we decided ultrasound is one of our basic radiologic technologies on the International Space Station, but we wanted to take it a little further. And so this particular gentleman worked with us, and again, we have that ultrasound on orbit. It is to actually not only identify something like a kidney stone, but to actually move the kidney stone and using the sound waves to move it out. So if any of you have ever had a kidney stone, you know how painful that is and how much you would appreciate somebody helping you move that along a little bit faster. But then we weren't done. We wanted to take high-frequency ultrasound. What happens if you take 3 different sound waves and where they cross or where they come together, the tissue heats? So could you take a probe in high-frequency ultrasound, and it does not cause any heating at the skin or in the fat tissue, but where those 3 sound waves cross, it creates a reverberation, it heats the tissue, and allows you to cauterize something like a liver laceration without opening the skin. So down here is our pig models where we actually did that, and it actually works, where we can actually cauterize tissue. Any of you who have ever been in the belly during surgery, that's the belly, and especially the liver, is a little hard to patch together. So if you could cauterize that wound without having to open the skin or open the belly, that would be a nice thing to have. Now, it's also nice in that when you go to Mars, it seems to always happen. I don't know if you've ever noticed the Antarctic expeditions. Who's the one that always gets sick? The doctor. It's a doctor who had the breast cancer in Antarctica. It's a doctor who took out their own appendix in Antarctica. And so it's always the doctor that gets sick. So if I'm going to have the Navy fighter pilot cauterize my liver laceration, I prefer he do it with this as opposed to opening my belly if I'm the doctor on Mars who gets injured. Ultrasound, this is one that we just utilized on the last landing. That's James Paterini, who's the flight surgeon working with Serena Anand. What he's looking at is his iPhone, and that is the Butterfly IQ ultrasound. Ultrasound used to have a big crystal in it, and then all the guts were in this thing that looked like a big laptop. Now the entire ultrasound is in that probe, and there is no crystal. It uses the technology similar to your iPhone, and it just uses the iPhone purely as a screen. So now imagine the ultrasound being in the pocket of most medical students or residents coming up in the next decade. It's actually deployable. We've already used it out in the field on our last landing. If you've ever had cataract surgery, even though they tell you to look straight ahead and they're about to use a laser on you, you always, your eye moves just a tiny bit. And so we have an algorithm that tracks the eye, and that's what we did on the International Space Station, so the laser can track with the eye so that your eye surgeon doesn't say, oops. This is a big thing that we have on the International Space Station with racks that actually can convert fluid and do osmotic things with fluid and filtration. Right now, we recycle urine, for example. We will recycle the urine, filter it, and then turn it into drinking water. Anybody want to sign up to be an astronaut now? But those types of membranes that we've invented also help with things like osmosis that you would use in dialysis patients, which are getting smaller and smaller. Material science, looking at transparent aluminum, transparent polymers and transparent enamels. So if you have a child with really expensive teeth, you can partially thank NASA for that as well. Most of you have probably wondered why they called that the space blanket. It's because the Mylar was invented for the Apollo missions. Most of you, I would say almost all of you, I'd be surprised if all of you did not have a piece of Skylab in your house. Anybody know what it is? Want to take a guess? Your smoke alarm. That was invented for the Skylab missions. Now, how does it help public health? How does NASA help public health? One of the things that we worked on recently was using our satellites, including the Aqua satellite, to identify what areas had the most moisture in soil and the right temperature for the growth of the Aedes mosquito. And that allows us to pinpoint where the epidemics of Zika were going to be. And so we were able to map that out, and that helps the public health forces identify where they want to send those kind of forces and deploy medical folks to treat Zika. Robotics is a big thing at NASA. This is Robonaut 2. Robonaut 2, we worked with the GM Corporation. Why does Robonaut look humanoid? You would like to think that there's some really sophisticated answer for that. It's because as a government organization, we didn't want to have tools for Robonaut and tools for an astronaut. It saves us money to have tools that both can use. And so the tools and the hands for Robonaut are so that it can use the same tools that the astronaut uses. That technology and that fidelity for all of those fingers and digits and the control also has changed prosthetics a great deal. Most of us remember when prosthetics were just a hook. Now they can actually pick up small objects with the prosthesis. And now also, thanks to iPhone and other things, you can change what the arm or prosthetic is supposed to do. Imagine you are cooking and you decide that you're going to go from small depth perception and moving of small objects to larger heavy objects like holding a pan handle. You can change that on your iPhone to change what the arm will do. And that's what she was showing here. Now, this is Valkyrie. Valkyrie actually takes Robonaut a little further. Valkyrie actually walks and talks. And the tests, we can actually have Valkyrie run and then get into a golf cart and drive it. We're not planning on having Valkyrie play golf, but if you needed to have a robot assistance on Mars or somewhere else, this would be a good thing to have. But that has also led to exoskeletons, which may help. We were looking at it to assist an astronaut on Mars because it's 1/3 G. Initially, when they go 6 months to Mars, they're going to have some decrease in their muscle mass and their bone, and so they might need some assistance initially lifting heavy objects, putting the habitat together on Mars. But that has also allowed us to use exoskeletons for paraplegics to allow them to walk with those assisted devices. The thing that we're working on right now with multiple universities, including Wake Forest and others, is 3D printing. And so imagine 3D printing where you can print someone on the right, lower right, they have, instead of doing a very painful skin graft, you're actually injecting or printing the skin directly onto the burned limb. And so we're actually using cells as a substrate for the 3D printer instead of just plastics. Now, how far can we take that? That's actually a functioning kidney in the upper right. And in the lower right, those cells will become a pancreatic cell. You can replace organs. Most of you have seen cochlear implants, but now imagine the cochlear implant actually in a 3D printed ear. Progenitor cell lines, this is something that we're looking at as well and studying in space. This will change certain things like diabetes a great deal, if you can imagine placing pancreatic cells onto a pancreas, a non-functioning pancreas for a diabetic to allow them to then begin to secrete insulin again. First infant that had a 3D printed tissue placed, this was an infant with tracheomalacia and had the baby's life saved by a 3D printed trachea that went into the infant. So now, What else can we print? One of the things that we're looking at is, can we print medication? We don't want to just take a whole bunch of bags of medication to Mars. The problem is that radiation. So radiation, will start to impact those medications and start to decrease their effectiveness. So you don't want Cipro to start out as Cipro and end up being coffee creamer by the time you get to Mars. And so we're looking at, can you take the constituents and then build it into a medication using 3D printing once you're there. Now, we've also looked and done experiments with artificial heart cells, again, Wake Forest with 3D printed beating cardiac cells. Now, we've actually done that on the International Space Station. This is Kate Rubin sequencing DNA and growing the cardiac cells on orbit. We also have a lot of microbiology that we do on the space station, as Nina mentioned. The vaccine research, viruses especially become a little bit more aggressive in space. That allows us to target different alleles on the virus. So we've done a lot of vaccine research, especially on Salmonella, as well as several other bacteria. Imagine MRSA, which is one of our targets that we're studying next, is imagine MRSA as a bacteria that causes billions of dollars and pounds to the economy that for every hospital stay, if you're able to develop a vaccine for that. Cancer cells take on a different view in space. They look more three-dimensional, which allows us to identify different targets on cancer cells. And this is the cancer research going on the International Space Station right now. Parkinson's right now, proteins take on a different structure in space, as well as crystals. We're doing microgravity research on the LRRK2 protein for Parkinson's right now on the International Space Station. Bone, as Nita mentioned before, the astronauts have thinning of the bone. They used to have about 1.5 to 2% bone loss per month, but we've been able to retard that a great deal with resistive exercise on board, as well as bisphosphonates and vitamin D. We look at technologies to transmit data up into the heads-up display, and in fact, we've worked on that up in the Arctic. Scott Kelly's mission and the one-year mission looking at genomics. We're about to release several studies that show all the different changes that occur into DNA with space, and also the genomics and the understanding of what happens to the genes and things like proteomics and epigenomics. In fact, we've had to rewrite some of the textbook because of what we learned on orbit right now. It's amazing the changes. We thought the telomeres would get shorter from the DNA, and actually they got longer. With Scott, there are a lot of changes that took place that kind of busted our knowledge of chromosomes and epigenomics. Now, this is an interesting one. If you've ever had a carotid intimal medial thickness ultrasound done, where we look at multiple different shades of gray to figure out how much of that is plaque in your carotid artery. That algorithm comes from the algorithm that we invented for looking at planets with 250 different shades of gray from Planetary Science. We do a lot with VR. In fact, we were doing VR before it was cool. This is the astronauts doing rehearsal for spacewalks in virtual reality before we have them do that in the pool, which is a neutral buoyancy lab. It's a massive pool that we have a mock-up of the space station down. It's about 50 feet deep in that pool. If you can imagine a pool the size of a football field that's 50 feet deep. And that translates into medical education, obviously, with virtual reality and how that's changing. So what do the astronauts go through? Well, first, when you get to space, you have all of this fluid. About 70% of your blood volume sits in your legs and your lower extremities and your butt. And all of that moves northward into your head and thorax. And so in the first few hours that you are in space, a couple of things occur. One of the things is the astronauts get what we call space adaptation syndrome. We used to call it space motion sickness, but it's actually not due to motion. It's actually due to the adaptation that they have in space. So think about it. When you are on the ground, how many of you got dizzy when Nina turned the Earth there, right? You have your visual cortex telling you where you are with the horizon. You have your semicircular canals telling you whether your head is turned left or right. Just standing here on the stage, I've got the pressure on the balls of my feet. or on the back of my feet to tell me if I'm leaning forward or back. I have what's called the Golgi tendon apparatus in my tendons, telling me whether my tendons are on a stretch or if they're slacked. When you're riding a bike, there's over 100 different signals that your brain interprets in a momentary notice to keep you steady and moving straight, both with your eyes, your semicircular canals, the muscles, etc. When you go to space, all of that changes in an instant. Once you've hit microgravity, your eyes are now lying to you because your partner is upside down and there is no horizon for you to match it up to. You're floating, so you don't have the Golgi tendon apparatus or the pressures on the ball of your feet. The otoliths, the little tiny stones in your semicircular canals, are floating, so your semicircular canal fluid doesn't tell you where you are. So what does your brain do when all of a sudden it's used to getting 100 different signals from different parts of your body and all of those cease at 1 second? Your brain says, I don't know what happened, but I'm going to throw up. And that's usually what happens. As the astronauts get nauseated, some of them have frank vomiting. And so we treat them with a drug that's really old called Phenergan. And we always have doctors say, well, Phenergan, that's like so 1950s. Why don't you guys use a different drug? The reason we use Phenergan is Phenergan's cleared through the liver. And remember that fluid shift that comes up? So it has a quick onset, but what's called the first pass phenomenon, and a quick offset. So the astronauts get over their nausea very quickly, and then they're able to do things like dock to the space station. Because of the bone loss, they actually have calcium going through their kidneys, which can cause kidney stones. And because of the fluid shift going up into their brain and their thorax, eventually over time, that fluid leaks out into their brain, and they actually get what we call cerebral edema or brain swelling, and some changes in their vision because of that. Female astronauts more at risk for cancer than male astronauts because of the breast tissue and the ovaries. So they have a slightly lower radiation threshold. And so, we might have somebody, well, that's not fair. That's, that's not very fair to the female astronauts that they have a lower threshold. But on the men's side, males have less vascular compliance. Their vessels don't stretch as well as females. They're a little stiffer. So they actually have more of the vision problems than the females do. So they actually have different unique things that occur male to female. So on the vision part, this is what we started to see on the International Space Station. We have in the back of the retina, we have what are called choroidal folds. Those are those little wrinkles in the back of the retina. We've had scotoma, that's where you get a blind spot. And we had, this is normally a nice round globe. We started to see flattening of the eye in the back, and that's from the optic nerve back here pressing the eye forward. And that's from the intracranial pressure that the astronauts have. So this gives you an idea. What's the shape of the eye here? This is pre-flight to post-flight. That's what's happening to their eyeball. And again, under different circumstances. Now, you can look at the back of the eye. This is the retina and the choroid layer, and watch what happens to it. The arrows will show you where it ends. Well, so you can see how it changes. So that's why they have a change in vision due to the optic nerve edema and the swelling in their brain. And it's actually a fairly thick scleral thickening that we have. They also have swelling in the brain. If you notice, these nice little white tracks here are the sulci. The gray ones are the gyri. That's the actual brain tissue. The sulci are the valleys in between the brain tissue filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Those get thinner as the brain swells a little bit. Now, that brain swelling goes down when they come back, but it takes time for it to go back, and it takes time for their vision to return to normal. This is the vehicle that we are building right now with Orion. There are a whole host, probably over 1,000 different medical requirements and standards in that vehicle that they have to follow. And just to give you an idea why we're so involved in the engineering for medical folks, this gives you an idea of what the astronaut can see when they are launching to space, but after 6 months in orbit with the cerebral edema and the optic nerve edema, this is what they can see coming back. And so you have to write that into the requirements and standards, that you need to be able to change the font and change the size and change the screen for those things. This gives you an idea of their exercise. Remember, there is no up and down in space, so the treadmill is actually on the side of the wall. they're actually upside down, if you will, when they're doing their resistive exercise. And then the treadmill, when they're running, these are bungees that hold Karen onto the treadmill, and the treadmill, you notice, is moving a lot. That's because it's on essentially a bag that is floating to give it vibration isolation. The reason we do that is because we're doing, protein crystal experiments and other things on the space station. We can't have vibration going through the space station, so we have to isolate that vibration. So if you can imagine running on a floating bag, bicycling on the wall and lifting weights on the ceiling, you have an idea about what the astronauts do on a daily basis. Obviously, all of those things come together for us to do our lunar missions and to try to figure out the answers to some things like the optic nerve edema for the astronauts so that we can go here. The missions are designed such, especially when we go to the moon, to be able to trial multiple different things, multiple different vehicles as well. And obviously this is where we're heading. Now, just to go off the human spaceflight for a second, just to talk about some of the other things. This is the Kepler mission, and this is how many exoplanets Kepler found prior to its being turned off at its end of mission. All of these are new planets that we didn't know existed before. And of those, there is a fairly high percentage that are in what we call the Goldilocks zone. That's where they are so far out from their sun that they could have liquid water, i.e. life, potentially. This is a star cluster that Hubble has looked at. There are over 14,000 stars in this picture alone, and this is about the size of a postage stamp looking at the Hubble view. And does anybody know what this is? This is the Hubble dark field. These are not stars, these are galaxies. So if you talk about millions of galaxies, and again, this is just one view, one small view of what Hubble was looking at. And it was looking at a dark patch of space. That's why it's called the Hubble dark field. So when we were doing the research, the head principal investigator wanted to aim Hubble and leave it there at that dark patch to see what light would come through and leave it there for a week. And all the investigators were like, oh, it's a waste of great telescope time, et cetera. And this is what Hubble found looking at that dark patch, was millions of galaxies. And then you take millions of galaxies and throw, the millions of stars in each millions of galaxy with millions of planets around, all of those stars. It gets to be a pretty amazing mathematical equation. And so with that, I have to show the shameless video for NASA here. I'll let the guys cue that up.
Ignition sequence start. All engines are running.
We have taken tremendous steps.
We choose to go to the moon before this decade is out.
We have achieved the earth-shaking, the breathtaking, the groundbreaking.
One small step for man.
And left a mark in the heavens. Our successes build one upon another and amplify what is possible.
The dawn of Orion.
It's time we take the next great leap. We're building the next chapter of American exploration, returning to the moon to stay, so we can go beyond to Mars, to expand what's possible and further our understanding. The architecture for these missions is already taking shape. We will go with new systems, bold designs, and a sustainable mission. You can hear it, taste it, touch it. We are going. We are training, testing, pressing our pioneering spirit into every component, defining our resolve with every line of code, and securing our success with every welcomed partnership. This is not hypothetical. This is not about flags and footprints. This is about sustainable science and feeding forward the advance of the human spirit. Because we are the pioneers, The star sailors, the thinkers, the visionaries, the doers. And because we stand on the shoulders of giants to go farther than humanity has ever been, we will add our names to the rolls of the greatest adventurers in history. Every day, every mission, we advance this call. We are NASA. And after 60 years, we're just getting started.
With that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, JD. It's fantastic. It's really, I don't often think wow at the end of presentations, but it's completely genuine. Just one thing, the drug 3D printing, we need that for Brexit. Could you, is there any way you could make a special version of that and just leave it behind for us? Because we're really struggling. In about 5 weeks, we need that. So that's the only thing I need from you.
I'll pick that up.
Okay. And my favorite line is, this is a big thing we have on the space station. That was one of your sentences.
It's a big thing.
This is a big thing we have on the space station. It's brilliant.
That's either due to my lack of sleep, my coffee at dinner, or I'm not sure if I'm...
Or what it was.
Or what it was.
No, you told us what it was. It was just a good opening. So some questions. We're going to have some electronic questions as well in a second, but there's a hand. There's a microphone making its way to you, particularly for the people who are listening online. We need you to speak into this. There we go.
Houston, we have a problem. Chris Still from NHS Ayrshire and Aaron in NHS Scotland. I'm interested about NASA's culture. So you've got to be safe. You've got to document what you do so you can go back and check where things could be improved. And yet you've got to have that development and improvement. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you'd give us some thoughts on how NASA manages culture change.
There are a couple things that I found unique coming from healthcare coming to NASA. The first was NASA expected failure, that if we weren't pushing the envelope far enough, if we weren't having 20% failure of some of our new innovations and projects, then we weren't doing enough. And that, so, you know, if you've got people that are only telling you successes, then that said that we weren't being innovative enough and we weren't pushing the envelope enough. The other part that I find really interesting there is they don't say no. When we are looking at mission architectures, if something does not exist right now, they say, well, it doesn't exist right now, but we're pretty confident we can invent it prior to us getting there. And I always think, who does that? But they do. They don't think, no, we can't get there. No, it's impossible. No, we'll never get there. There's not a negative mentality to it. They're fairly confident with a lot of bright minds on it that they will be able to come up with something. And the third part is looking for innovation outside their usual bailiwick, if you will. Like the Space Shuttle main engine for heart failure. You know, sometimes we will put we've put challenges out on a company board called Incentive. I don't know if you've seen that or not, where you can put a challenge out and have the public solve it. And we're always amazed where the solvers come from. We had a radiation problem that I think it was a Polish chemical engineer solved for us because he saw some similarities to something that he did in chemical engineering. And so we have a habit in medicine of looking only at medicine to come and solve our problems, but there are a lot of things from the aviation industry, space industry, engineering, et cetera, that can be brought to bear in systems engineering into healthcare that I think we miss some of those opportunities. The last part about culture is, you know, showing those stars and galaxies at the end, it actually impacts your culture. And I'll give you an idea of that. When you were a small child and you left your hometown for the first time to go to grandma's house or whatever, when did you first think, we're home? It's usually, you know, the sign for your city, right? You know, so if you saw Renfrew or Glasgow, you thought, oh, we're home. It wasn't when you actually entered the door of your house. And then as you got older and you traveled and you went to another country, then when you landed in your country, when the first time you land after you've been flying somewhere and you land back at your home airport, you think, oh, we're home. And then as you get a little older and you travel a little bit further and you're going to another continent, when do you first feel like you're home? Well, for me, even when I land in New Jersey, I feel like, oh, I'm back home in the States. And for me to say that about New Jersey, that's a big stretch. And so, distance and exploration and changes your perspective and your point of view. And our astronauts, ironically, when this came to mind for me is when they landed in Kazakhstan, and I was a flight surgeon for Expedition 6, and Don Pettit says, we're home, we're back on Earth. And I thought, wow. So when will it be when they enter the solar system and they think, oh, we're home, we're in our solar system? How far does that carry out? But it changes in that when you look at that small pale blue dot after the sea of galaxies and other things, suddenly all those little things that we worry about here on Earth, racial tension, sex, this, that, another, Brexit, all of those look really microscopically small because once you get out there, we're the human race, we're not different individualized people or countries. So it changes your perspective a great deal. And so I've noticed that NASA, they kind of view the world in a slightly different way than somebody who's not exposed to all of those distances and all of that type of exploration would view it. Does that answer your question? I mean, it's kind of multifaceted from a culture standpoint.
It's a great answer. Anybody else? There we go, right here. Microphone's on its way.
Claire McCauley, I'm an oncologist by training, and so I'm interested in the radiation and the cancer exposure, and whether you're working on prophylactic, preventative type things, knowing that that's a risk, and whether there's any of that might be translatable in the fullness of time.
Yes. Well, the answer is yes and yes. But again, because of our N being so small and the experiments that we can do on orbit, we have to rely on folks then taking it much further on the ground. And so the researcher, again, that's working with NIH, National Institutes of Health, looking at the cancer research is then identifying those different targets on the cancer cells, applying that to immune therapies on the ground, and figuring out if they can find different alleles or different areas on that cell that they can then go attack. So it's NASA has a part of it, but it's not like we're going to go out and do a randomized trial on 5,000 cancer patients. For our astronauts, though, for protection, we look at multiple material science. There's three ways to reduce cancer for an astronaut: time, distance, and shielding. I can decrease their time. So right now it's 6 months to Mars. So if the guys develop better engines and I get to Mars faster, hey, less radiation exposure. Distance from the source, and then, of course, shielding with materials. We've looked at things like active radiation shielding, where you actually have a spinning magnet that prevents some of the different particles from getting in. And we've looked at pharmaceuticals. There are some pharmaceuticals, for example, that could stop apoptosis. RX-100 will stop apoptosis. So if someone had an acute radiation poisoning from a solar event, we could stop apoptosis. The problem with stopping apoptosis, as you know, is you want some of those cells to die if they're, estranged and having anomalies. And so now we've prevented them from dying from the acute radiation sickness, but now we have to worry about the cancer that we probably are going to give them in the long term. So we have some unlikely partners that look at things. Homeland Security. And so you think, what's Homeland Security and exploration have much to do with each other? But they look at nuclear events from a terrorism standpoint and look at medications that they might have to give EMS or other folks or hospital workers that are going to be in that zone taking care of patients. And so we look at those to see, could we use those for astronauts as well, or could we use those for cancer patients?
Right in the front here.
Thanks very much. I'm Graham Gold. I've got a question probably inspired a little by David Bowie, who Major Tom was quoted as having to take protein pills to put his helmet on. Can you tell us a little bit about the influence NASA and the research has had on human nutrition.
Well, that's an interesting case, but it's probably multifaceted. One, the human tissue side, we look at, can we, like we showed in the 3D printing, can we take human tissue and actually make it a substrate for us to replace injured cells, whether that's on an organ or whether that's on a skin surface layer. Skin tissue, as far as the radiation aspect on space, alpha particles stop in the first couple of layers, and so we only worry about cancer, for example, and melanomas from ultraviolet radiation and deeper particles that impact. And let's see, what else can I tell you about human tissue for that? What's very interesting for me is how adaptable the human body has been. They all seem to reach a plateau. When you're in space, you don't lose so much bone that your bones disintegrate and you fall into a pile. Your body finds a new homeostasis, a new level, if you will. The body adapts, and every cell and every tissue seems to do that on long-duration spaceflight. Does that answer your question at all? Is that
nutrition?
Yeah, with nutrition as well. Yeah, nutrition's been really important from a vitamin D standpoint for us, for bone health. What's the hard part's getting the astronauts to eat the stuff that we want them to eat necessarily. Their taste buds change because of the fluid shift. You've got more blood going to different taste buds. So they like spicy food, shrimp cocktail with lots of horseradish sauce and things like that they wouldn't eat on the ground. And so, we'll get a call down that they want really spicy stadium mustard. I mean, there's odd stuff like that. So when the Russians will fly fruit and vegetables, et cetera, they're like, yeah, so trying to get them to eat all of those is important. They don't eat enough because of the fluid shift. They feel full because they've got a lot of fluid in their abdomen as well. So we try to work with them on all those nutraceuticals.
That's a Glasgow diet. That doesn't sound unlike most of Glasgow eats. That's about. We have an astronaut's diet.
There you go,
Greg.
So thanks, JD. That was just wonderful to take us through that lecture there. The question I've got is, one of the things I've always associated with NASA and their astronauts is the courage that they have. Strapping yourself to the top of one of those Saturn V rockets and getting ready to kind of launch, it just must be a real one of the most stressful experiences these guys can ever be part of. But as you're preparing to go even further and to go to Mars, how do you start to deal with some of the emotional stresses and indeed some of the potential mental health problems that these people might suffer on a trip like that?
Well, we look back and we benchmark against several different missions. One, we were talking about this at dinner, Shackleton's missions in the Antarctic. Where they had a problem was when they no longer had fruitful work. So when they were stuck in the ice and they were just sitting around, they were ready to kill each other. But he started to give them jobs to do and, work on the ship, repair this and the other. And as long as they had fruitful work, they were in actually pretty good shape. I think that will probably apply to the exploration missions as well. Well, we did have some unexpected findings when we first developed the space station. We thought, we've got this thing called an IP phone, Internet Protocol phone. It'll be great after their shift. They'll be able to call home, talk to their spouse, talk to their wife, talk to their husband or their daughter or son. We pat ourselves on the back, thought this is fantastic from a behavioral health standpoint. So here's what happened. After the full work day, astronaut calls home. I thought you were going to call the roofer before you left for this mission. So I tell you what, mister, next time you come back around, guess what you're doing? You're calling the roofer. And oh, by the way, Johnny got a D in math. And who's the one who tutors him in math? You. So what we found was that the problems from home started to creep up on the International Space Station. And it was a good and bad thing. They felt connected, but they felt connected. And so it was, a pro and con. And so, how we will deliver bad news, for example, when you're going to Mars. We had a couple of astronauts. The one thing that struck me, Frank Culberson and a few others, they expect the world to be the same as when they left. That was shocking to them when it was not. So Frank, when he left, was pre-9/11, and then he came back after 9/11. The airports changed, the security changed, the culture changed, all sorts of things changed. Krikalev left, and he was a Soviet, his passport was a Soviet passport. When he came home, it was the Russian Federation, and his passport was no good. So for them, that was the hardest part for them, was that they expected the world to be the same when they came back, and it wasn't. And if you can imagine, 3 years is a long time right now. You know, in politics, it's forever for some of these. So if you can imagine going to Mars and then coming back 3 years later and having everything change, you know, that for them was hard for them mentally. We did not anticipate that. We thought about other things, like, you know, what happens if your mom dies when you're on a mission, or what happens if this, and how are you going to deal with those kinds of stresses, or if something's going on with your child and you can't help them because you're in space. But we did not anticipate that aspect on the mental aspect of the astronauts.
Leading on from that, Mattis Heitman, I'm a gastroenterologist and hepatologist here in Glasgow. How do you deal, or how do people deal with working as a very small group together and not being able to go away, or how do you deal with conflict? Or bang doors?
We were, Jason and I were talking about, we have for 12 slots in the last astronaut corps. We had 17,000 people apply. And so one of the things that we do is when we get toned down to a number, you know, in the 50s, we have folks come and they work. We take them out to do team things together. And the psychiatrists will probably eliminate more people than the physicians, the medical doctors do, because they are like, all right, flaming narcissist out. Yeah, that guy, you know, they will kill him and shove him out the airlock by the time they get to Mars. And so those folks, you know, that team dynamic we look at, and we do multiple different types of exercises. One of the things that they do together as what we call astronaut candidates is they do survival school together. We send them up in the Canadian wilderness and have them do survival school. What's funny for me is we'll get people who don't know anything about space that will say, oh, you should fly a married couple. And I'm thinking, I can't drive 3 days on a vacation with my wife without us being at each other's throat. I can't imagine 6 months to Mars. My wife would eject me out the hatch. So we look at group dynamics a great deal to see who complements each other. And you got to imagine these are mostly type A people, right? I mean, you got 17,000 people that, and we're literally discarding people like, oh, he's only got 2 PhDs and he was a Navy SEAL. Oh, not good enough. So, you know, you're discarding some really quality folks that are all very type A, and you get a bunch of type A folks in a spacecraft. Everybody wants to be in charge, and so you have to figure out that dynamic a great deal, and the psychiatrists work on it a great deal, and it's interesting to see. And we put them through miniature missions as well to see what that dynamic's going to be.
But you shouldn't just send up orthopedic surgeons, no?
No.
It's not going to work.
No, maybe not.
A couple in the front here. 3 in the front, 3 in a row here. So why don't we do 2 together, and then we'll do one.
Yeah, I'm very much a lay person. My question was, you said earlier about how obviously I was just wondering about like the things sort of looking small when you work in NASA and you look back at racial tensions and politics and that, and it looks like nothing. But obviously, unfortunately, those people control your funding.
Right.
So I was just wondering, what is it like to have to work with people? I'm thinking of one guy in particular, maybe, and explaining things to people who have all of the control and just none of the awareness or knowledge of some of the things that you have to deal with.
Let's see. This is going out, right? Let's see. How am I going to answer that politically correctly? I think the most frustrating thing for NASA, probably on the politics side, is in order for us to truly do exploration, we have to have a consistent mission. And so when you have a changeover in a presidential administration or changeover in Congress such that the mission constantly changes, it's hard to get moving down the pike a little bit, where you're, okay, we're going to the moon. Oh, nope, new administration. We're going to go to an asteroid. Oh, nope, now we're going to Mars. Oh, nope, we're going to the moon. Well, when you're building a rocket that has a specific feature and a specific design for a specific mission, and then somebody changes the mission, that's the hard part for us, where it's like, okay, we were going to Mars, right? Yeah, okay. Can we use this for an asteroid? Well, I guess we could take this part off and put this part on, and it's constantly redesigning for the politics. So if I were king for a day, I would have us have a consistent measure of funding and consistent mission for 10 or 20 years, and then we'd be able to accomplish a lot more, I think, than if it keeps changing.
Sensitively done, J.D.
There. You can tell the art of politics.
You've done that before.
I've actually had to go to PR class a couple of times.
Yeah.
Like, send him back.
Indeed.
I'm a medical student. I was just following on from that kind of psychology kind of crew selection thing. With regards to like a permanent colony in space, hopefully one day that's probably going to be bigger than the crews that we have now. How do you think the psychology and the crew selection is going to change because of that?
I think initially it won't be a big deal because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Because initially you're going to need like the botanist. Like you think back to the Martian movie, right? Mark Watney was the botanist. Well, even if he's horribly annoying, that guy, you're relying on that guy for your food. So suddenly you're going to tolerate that guy a little bit more. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think, starts to dictate. And you're going to have a lot of folks that are multi-trained, that somebody is the botanist and the engineer for this, and somebody is the physician and the engineer for this. And so folks are going to have to be multiple trained for cross coverage, because you'd hate to have like the guy that is the sole engineer working on your food fall off the cliff, and the rest of you are like, oh, well, I wonder what are we going to do now? So you're going to have cross coverage and training there. But I think, obviously you're going to have to tolerate those folks for 18 months. We'll have to put an ethical framework together. Who's going to decide an argument? Who's going to, what laws or rules we're going to use there if there's a disagreement? Or there's some construct that you have to build on top of that people are going to have to agree to before they go, which it'll make it very interesting.
My question was more medical as well. I was just wondering what you think are the main challenges and differences that are going to arise from the fact astronauts are going to be in partial gravity around the Moon and Mars. We've done a lot of research in microgravity, but what would the big difference be?
Well, good question. What we're hoping for, and this is one of the best things for using the Moon for a testing bed before Mars. So the Moon has 1/6 G, Mars has 1/3 G. So anything that's going to work in 1/6 G will work in 1/3 G, right? So one of the things, like this big fluid shift up at the brain swelling is 1/6 G, just a little bit of G, enough to pull that fluid down to where we're not going to have this cerebral edema and optic nerve edema and brain swelling. We're hoping so, but the only way to do that is to go to the Moon, stay there long enough to say, all right, can you still see? Can you still see? Can you still see? Do you have any change? And then to check their MRIs when they get back. But we are hopeful that even that partial gravity changes the fluid shift enough that we can get an increase in bone density, and we can get a decrease in the fluid shift up into the brain and the optic nerve. So we're hoping that that's a good testing ground for us.
Where's Jennifer? Anything from online, Jennifer? This will be the test if anybody has actually been able to join online, because we don't actually know.
Yep, so we have had quite a few people joining us online, and we've got quite a lot of questions and comments. So I've just gone through and pulled out just a couple for us. So the first one I've got is from Pete Hodgkinson, and Pete is Wing Commander with the Royal Air Force. And Pete says, great talk, thanks.
He says he is.
Yeah. What input have your NASA medical teams had to medical system elements of Boeing and SpaceX commercial crew vehicles? And what will capability be like to these vehicles, for example, medical evacuation compared with Soyuz capability?
Okay, let me see if I understood that one. I was having trouble hearing you, but I think the biggest thing for the commercial crew vehicles is, remember, those vehicles are going to be essentially taking the astronauts only to the space station. They are not going to be for long-duration exploration, et cetera. So we only have to have a medical capability for those for the transit from Earth to the space station, which they can dock within 8 to 12 hours if we wanted them to, and we launched at the right aperture. So we really don't have to have a lot of medical infrastructure for those commercial vehicles, which is a good thing. The question is, could you use the commercial vehicles have different aspects about them that make them unique. For example, the SpaceX and Boeing are both capsules that would have a higher G, 6 to 8 Gs coming in, from reentry. If you were low on blood pressure, let's say you had a medical event on orbit, let's say you had an inferior MI, I didn't do my job looking at your preventive medicine, and somehow you had a heart attack in space, and you had low blood pressure. That 6 to 8 Gs coming back might do you in, versus a vehicle like the space plane that Sierra Nevada has that would have a very 1 to 2 G reentry. So each of them have their pros and cons that they bring to the table. SpaceX lands in the ocean. Boeing lands on land. If I needed to get you to a trauma center very quickly, and I landed you in Nevada, that's a little easier to get you to the Las Vegas Trauma Center or Los Angeles Trauma Center than I have to go get you in the ocean and pluck you and then try to get you back to a trauma center. So from a medical standpoint, they each have their pros and cons and unique aspects for each of the commercial vehicles.
You told me at dinner that there's one scenario in which we may have to use a Scottish hospital.
Yes, actually, most people don't know that.
Be afraid.
And he's serious. When we get the astronauts right now off a Russian Soyuz, they land in Kazakhstan, and we transport them back on a jet rather rapidly after they land to get them back to do all the science. And the place that we refuel is in Paisley. And so we work with the Chief Medical Officer of Scotland and identified the hospitals in case the astronauts had a problem on the way back, where we would take them.
That's the Royal Alexander.
Oh
my word! Maybe we should talk before you. Ian Keith is in the crowd. Maybe we should talk.
I'm calling Ian direct.
I mean, it's the right
I got
thing
his
to
card
do.
now, right?
The right choice.
I'll just call him direct. But yeah, we actually would take the astronauts to the facility here in Scotland if they had any problem on the mission back.
Jennifer.
Okay, so another question from Zainab Mabani, who's a student from the University of Leeds, and Zainab asks, how do astronauts detect critical conditions such as stroke and traumatic brain injury in space? What would the procedure be if a critical condition develops, and would the use of biomarkers be useful for diagnosis in future missions?
Oh, we're getting really deep on that one. That's good. Okay. Well, first of all, shock shows up late because, remember, all this fluid from your lower extremities is shoved up into your torso and your head and thorax. And so it's not like when you're on the ground where you're in shock and you have to compress all those veins, and that's why you get cold and clammy because all the blood's being pushed up into your thorax to try to keep you alive. It's already there. And so an astronaut wouldn't show up as hypotensive until much later in the game. For traumatic brain injury, we really don't, unless they're really zooming really fast to the module of the International Space Station, we don't have a lot of history of traumatic brain injury. But if we had trauma on orbit, they have the ability to do IV fluids on orbit, which, by the way, most of you know that works on gravity, right? So you'd have to do that on a pressure bag and put the fluids under pressure in order to get it to run into the astronaut. And the question would be, when we go on an exploration mission, what things would we take with us? You got to remember, on an exploration mission, it's going to be close to $20,000 per pound for me to take something up into orbit. And so, a 2-pound bag of IV fluids may cost 40 grand just to launch. So we're going to actually make a lot of the IV fluids on the Moon and Mars using water and then sterilizing it and turning it into saline and things of that nature. As far as what biomarkers we look at, it's actually not a biomarker but a vital sign. An astronaut who's in trauma or will have low blood pressure, before their blood pressure goes down because of that fluid shift, actually what you see first is tachycardia. And so you'll see the heart rate go up if they are hypovolemic. Because they already have cerebral edema after a 6-month mission, if they don't have a lot of space in there to absorb traumatic brain injury, so they would actually be in danger of Cushing syndrome or Cushing reflex, where they'd get bradycardic very quickly if they had traumatic brain injury, because they've already got a lot of brain edema to go with it. So, good question, though.
Ian Paisley, right in the centre. The microphone coming. It's because you're halfway between them. They don't know which one to. Here it comes.
It's more of a two-part question. The brain edema, does that cause cognitive dysfunction in their astronauts? And secondly, if there is trauma, we've seen it also in the videos of all the liquid flowing about. What do you do with all the blood? You get a squirter.
Yeah. So the edema, does it cause any other function other than the vision change? Good question. The thing that we worry about, and the reason we do MRIs pre and post flight, is when a cell is edematous, and it's edematous for months. Now, granted, it's a mild edema, right? They on a Frisson scale for optic nerve edema, they level out at level 2. They don't go all the way up to 3, 4, 5. So, it's not like a traumatic brain injury edema, but it's a mild global edema that's there for months. And a cell, as most of you know, when a cell is edematous, it's not very good at getting rid of its waste products. So the question is, what happens to those cells then? And now there should be a journal article, I think it's released this week, in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, that actually we also are seeing white matter edema, which is the cortical tracts. So then the question becomes, what is the long-term implication of that? Are they going to get white matter hyperintensities? Are they going to get protein that lays down in there because the cells are inefficient at getting rid of waste products? And will that cause long-term sequelae in the astronauts? That's our biggest concern. On the short-term effect, the one problem that most people don't realize is the CO2 is elevated on the space station. It's hard to scrub CO2 down to the level that you have on the ground at that 1% level. It's about 10 times higher on the International Space Station. Now, that wasn't a big deal for short-duration missions like the Space Shuttle and Apollo and Gemini and Mercury. But when you're up there for 6 months, it's becoming a bigger deal. Why? Because CO2 is a potent vasodilator. So the brain's, usually when the brain has a little bit of edema, the brain tries to shunt blood and constrict vessels and decrease the amount of blood coming up to the choroid plexus and elsewhere. And unfortunately, the one mechanism in the Monroe-Kelly doctrine that allows the brain to try to compensate for that swelling, we're thwarting with that CO2 that's elevated. So nothing's easy in space flight. It's like we've had I had an ophthalmologist say, well, why don't you guys just use Diamox? Well, the problem with Diamox, we use that with mountain climbers when they get cerebral edema, but Diamox also lowers the intraocular pressure. If I lower the intraocular pressure and it lowers more than the intracranial pressure, you get what's called hypotony, which means I make the choroidal folds worse in the back of the eye. And also, by the way, Diamox increases calcium clearance through the kidneys, and that could give me a kidney stone. So your cerebral edema might be slightly better, but your vision could be worse, and you could have a kidney stone. So the flight director would not be happy with me. But that's the hard part with space physiology. Is every time we have a good idea, there's always something that seems to make it an interesting facet.
Let's have one more, Jennifer, and then we'll draw it to a close.
Make it an easy one, Jennifer. Come on.
They're all quite tough today, and I'm just reading them out. So I've got a question here from Sarah Berent, and Sarah is a student at Glasgow University. And Sarah asks,
JD, it'd be fantastic if you could expand on what opportunities you see for immunotherapies, potentially with the use of 3D printing in preventing cancer and diseases in astronauts on their venture to Mars.
Okay, well, for 3D printing, where I see it going, I mean, they've already made a small functional kidney for 3D printing. We've already had cardiac stem cells beating on orbit, and we're not even, we're just now beginning to look at 3D printing and cells and tissues. We're not even at the hallmark or the tipping point for that. Where I see that going is a couple of things. One, I probably won't take a lot of surgical instruments with me to the moon and Mars. Instead, I'll print them. Because if I ever try to guess which instruments to take, it's going to happen, right? And then I'm going to think, where's the Army-Navy retractor? And, it's the one thing we didn't bring. It seems like, that's why I make 9 trips to Home Depot whenever I'm doing a project at my house. I never get the right tool. But if you could print it in a just-in-time method, then you could actually print certain surgical instruments or medical instruments. But then also, can I eventually, decades from now, will we be able to print something for somebody that has a particular organ that's failed or been injured or crushed? Think of what we do now with bone and bone stimulation, waiting for bone to grow. You've seen people in exoskeletons after they've had a femur shattered, and it takes months. Imagine if I could actually just lay down the bone with a 3D printer for them, or print it in the lab and then place it using their own cultured bone cells. Those are pretty interesting, phenomenal things that are coming up, I think.
JD, thank you very much. For those of you who haven't followed American politics, JD only got paid for December yesterday. So we nearly didn't get him at all because of the shutdown. On Friday, if he doesn't get out of the country by Friday, he may be stuck in the country. I think that might be a good thing for us. We would. There's a deputy chief medical officer job going if you want it. Later on tonight. We would love to have you back. We genuinely are grateful that you came and spent your time with us, amongst all the other things you could have done. What's the committee called you're going to tomorrow?
I'm on the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space.
Isn't that cool?
So
I'm not on that committee.
Yeah.
That is the coolest. Yeah. That is the coolest committee I think I've ever heard of. So we have a little gift for you, and it's just to say thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Jason. Much obliged. No, pleasure's all mine. Now, I do have one thing I have to do. So, at the end of a mission, whenever we have somebody that's a biomedical engineer or a flight surgeon that's done a really good job, if they've done something that has impacted and they are behind the scenes making a mission better, they get what's called the Chief Medical Officer's coin. Now, you can't spin that coin anywhere. It's just a really cool little artifact. But I think there's one person back there in the very back who does a lot of behind-the-scenes work, who is probably one of the reasons I ended up coming down here.
For sure, she's the reason you ended up here.
And I've also had a hard time saying no whenever she asked me to do anything. So, Jennifer, I need you to come down and accept the Chief Medical Officer's coin. Of course, she's going to get all red. All right. Now, Nigel doesn't have one, by the way. No, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the last word. Just you can have a seat, JD.
I will.
Just for the last 2 minutes. Carol Wilkinson is the chair of the board of Healthcare Improvement Scotland. QI Connect is a product of Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So just to send us on our way and say a few thank yous, please welcome Carol Wilkinson.
Thank you, Jason. Healthcare Improvement Scotland is very proud of its QI Connect program. It's a real opportunity to connect people and exchange knowledge and experience. I'm sure you'll agree with me that tonight's session has been particularly special, and I want to add my thanks to Dr. Polk for his contribution. He's taken us to a breadth and a depth of experiences and knowledge, which I think is quite breathtaking. and has allowed us to lift ourselves, I think, a bit above some of the day-to-day fray. I'd have to say that I really enjoyed listening to the developments and how they can inform medicine and how we can all benefit from them. I'm not sure you'd ever have me queuing up to actually go into space. As someone who doesn't like confined spaces, I'd find that really, really difficult. But thank you very much. I shall leave here feeling educated, informed, and entertained in equal measure, and I'm sure other people here will too, so thank you. Add my thanks to Jennifer and the staff of Healthcare Improvement Scotland, who put a lot of work into this programme, and particularly into this evening, and tend not always to be recognised for what they do. So thank you all very much. And finally to Nina, I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed that stargazing. It was quite spectacular and quite awesome. So thank you for that experience. Thank you very much. And thank you all for giving up your Monday evening, for coming with all your educated and informed questions. And I hope you have a safe and pleasant journey home. Thank you very much.